a play on a stage, controlling minds like a hive. And when I shine a light on the lies, what I find is a play on a stage, controlling minds like a hive. When I was young, I believed what they told me.
Hello, my name is Jaime Powell, and I'm welcoming you to Tending the Threshold. This is a multi-part series where we deal with challenging topics that are alive and present in our world right now. And before we begin today, I'd like to begin with a territorial acknowledgement. This show is being filmed in what's called Ashland, Oregon. That is originally the land of the Takelma and Shasta people. And so we want to acknowledge that this land was not given freely, and we still inhabit this land to this day. And this seems very relevant to the topic that we are discussing today, which is titled Remembering, Appropriation, Reclamation, and Reparation. And I'd like to introduce my co-host. This is Holly Truhlar. And Holly, would you be willing to say a few words about yourself and your connection to this show and this project?
Absolutely, thank you so much. So my name is Holly Truhlar. I'm a lawyer and a transpersonal therapist. I work specifically with collective grief and trauma, and I also do some community organizing and also some event organizing. I did a large event called Tending the Threshold, so that's some of it. And I'm super excited to be here with you and our guest.
Yeah, thank you. So I will introduce our guest. This is Louise Paré, and Louise is here, and we created the name of today's show together, all three of us: Remembering, Appropriation, Reclamation, and Reparation. So Louise, will you introduce yourself and just say a little bit about your connection to this topic today?
Well, it's a real joy for me to be part of this conversation, especially with such auspicious women and women who have the courage to bring up topics that are disruptive to the way we usually live our lives. My doctorate is in women's spirituality and cultural transformation. It comes out of the School of California Institute of Integral Studies. The program was started in 1994 and was the first doctoral program of its kind. So I'm really delighted to be able to bring that background, the community of women who informed me and encouraged me to explore these topics, especially the topic of remembering. Part of the emphasis, a major emphasis of my doctoral study had to do with how the body knows and remembers. And so the whole area of somatics, kinesthetic memory became something that I really delved into, and it was really powerful to learn and to experience that memory is not just in what we call the brain, that one of the most powerful forms of memory is in our blood and breath and bones and flesh, and we're talking about skin and bodies, which is something that also gets really denigrated in what you had talked about in the last episode, which was white culture. So that whole process of diving deep into vibrational memory, into resonant memory, in order to really know who I am, is a really important enterprise in order to be a fully integrated human being. And when that isn't known, when I don't know what my roots are, in the yogic tradition we would be talking in that philosophy about the first chakra, what my roots are, then there's a real destabilization of who I am in my community. And so one of the things that happens with a destabilized community that is cut off from or unaware of their roots is cultural appropriation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, Louise, for introducing yourself and for really opening up the topic of remembering. And we chose the word remembering and hyphenated on purpose. And I think the first step is really acknowledging what is appropriation. And these are sensitive topics. And so I just want to invite our viewers and ourselves to take a nice deep breath. Part of, really working with the body and the soma is to connect with the breath. And So that's what we're doing. And it can be challenging to face one's shadow and to really take a look at whiteness, at white supremacy, at these topics, and to see, wow, I am a racist. Wow, I have this within me. And then to go a little bit deeper and to see where that comes from, to move through the phases of shame and guilt, to actually move into what we'll deal with a little bit later in the show, which is reclamation and reparation. But before we move to those phases, I also want to honor the way that we started this whole series, Tending the Threshold, was with Holly's beautiful model of RAW, the radical attunement work. And here we are moving through those phases right now. So would you be willing just to speak through quickly how we're moving through those with the first topic that we did, which was whiteness, and then now as we move into cultural appropriation, reclamation, and reparation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. So the radical attunement work model, which we covered in episodes 1 and 2, has 4 phases. And the first one is acknowledgement, which is just speaking something, naming something, which we're doing here. We did it last episode, naming whiteness, and this episode, naming a cultural appropriation. And then it moves into awareness, which is just building more consciousness around it. And so there's somatic awareness, which we've just touched on some, emotional somatic awareness, and then also an analysis, a historical analysis can be done, a systemic analysis can be done, which we'll do a little bit of here, and we've already done some of. And then the next step after awareness is action or activation. So what is, given the awareness that I've built, maybe I've done grief work with this awareness, maybe I've done the historical analysis, then what is the right action to take? Or another word for this is activism. What activism work do I want to do? Which we'll talk a little bit about at the end of this episode. And we talked a little bit about it at the end of last episode too. And then the last phase is ascension or expansion. And so it's just this idea that as I take right action towards my beloved or aware right action, I feel expanded. I feel interconnected to you guys, to whatever the topic is that I've just walked through this model with. And so I see us doing that in each moment, hopefully, and also throughout these next two episodes that we're doing right now.
Yeah, thank you, Holly.
Yeah.
And a big reason that I was so delighted to have you, Louise, on the show is because I feel and experience you moving through this model, this awareness, this acknowledgement, the action, and the ascension piece. And so before we kind of go through those phases, I'd just love to pull up a definition from Wikipedia of appropriation or cultural appropriation. So we'll pull that Wikipedia definition up so you can see easily. You could probably just Google this in your own phones. But here we have cultural appropriation is the adoption of elements of a minority culture. And that word, sometimes can be, not as respectful as possible. So I like to use the word marginalized culture. So cultural appropriation is the adoption of elements of a marginalized culture by members of the dominant culture. It is distinguished from an equal cultural exchange due to an imbalance of power, often as a byproduct of colonialism and oppression. So cultural appropriation has a unique flavor to it. It has a unique vibration to it. And if I'm tuned in on the somatic level and I start to bring this awareness into myself, I can actually feel when it's happening. And it's a very interesting topic for me because I have made my living for the most part of this 20 years that I've been an adult as a yoga teacher. And so I want to just open up the topic of cultural appropriation for both of you and for myself too. And how have you seen cultural appropriation in your own communities? How do we see it here in Ashland, Oregon? How do we see it, on the larger scene? Because we're doing this show here in Ashland, but we're also, making it available globally so that people everywhere can start to take a look at what's the original landholders of the area before colonization, and how does cultural appropriation show up in all the communities locally and globally. So I'd love to hear from both of you if you have any input on that. I know you do.
Well, after I went back to North Dakota, where I spent 13 years, and when Standing Rock began to emerge. And when I returned from Standing Rock, I became very aware, even more aware, of how the appropriation, the cultural appropriation of Native American culture had really grown significantly over the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years. I teach a class at Ollie called Native American Women Changemakers Leading from the Earth. And I often get the question, are you Native American? And I respond by saying, I'm wearing today something that is from my indigenous culture, which is that of the Trypillian culture of Ukraine. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. And I began to understand that part of that desire for roots, when the study and the exploration is not done about what preceded my ancestry, then there is a legitimate longing to fill that void for roots. And so oftentimes that gets expressed by either taking on the culture of another group or by denigrating that group. So when I was teaching that class, one of the Native American women who I was fortunate to have as a guest pointed out to me that I was using the language for sacred female spirits of goddess. And she said, you know, in our culture, we don't have any such language as goddess. And I kind of knew that, but I hadn't paid attention to that. So I went back through my course materials and changed the language so that it would reflect more authentically that in Native culture that would be referred to as a female sacred spirit. And so that was something that was really important for me to make that effort, to make that change, so that what I was working with was authentic and not imposing upon Native American understandings of that female sacred spirit, something from Indo-European understandings. So it's a small example, but significant because our language shapes the dynamics we have with each other.
Yeah. Thank you, Louise, for that example. And Holly, I'm guessing you have a few examples of cultural appropriation that you've seen or experienced in this area or in circles that you've been a part of?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, right, we could go into this forever, but I want to give just some, I guess, quick or easy examples. And so an example would be someone who isn't a part of this culture or hasn't earned the right to something like this, wearing a pair of moccasins that are specific to a certain tribe and maybe not even knowing that that's what they're doing. Another example would be people smudging, can be an example of appropriation. And then I would say sometimes when there are white people in drum circles doing especially sort of like African tribal drumming, that can be an example of appropriation. And then something I see in Ashland a lot that I think is worth conversation, and I know we've talked about it, is the practice of yoga. And the way that it's done sometimes can be appropriation. And for me, when I think about appropriation, a lot of it has to do with having earned the right to that wisdom or that thing. And so there's something that I've found in colonized culture or white culture where we just think we should get all the things. And it partially has to do with what's been mentioned of this like void or this hole that we feel. So we're constantly trying to fill it, but we also just think we have the right to all these things. And I've noticed that in a lot of actual cultures, you have to earn the right to wisdom, or, you know, like an initiation period will be your whole life up until you're a certain age, 13 or something like that, or certainly a whole year. You're preparing for that ritual and that ceremony. And then I've noticed in white culture, which isn't really a culture, but in dominant culture, it's like a 2-day initiation. And you're doing this thing. And so it has, for me, it has a lot to do with earning that wisdom. And sometimes also recognizing like that wisdom is never going to be mine. Like I wasn't born, I've been born with this particular lineage, and me bringing that lineage forth is really important. And not taking from other lineages. But that conversation around yoga is important to me. And I'm curious as a yoga teacher how that lands for you.
Well, yes, it definitely is something that I, lately have been opening almost every one of my classes because I'm in this study of Hi, my name is Jamie. I'm here to share yoga, and I've never been to India, and I am a white person with Italian and Polish and Welsh descent. And so I have a friend and a fellow teacher named Michelle Johnson who's just written a book called Yoga and Social Justice. And so and she's a Black woman. And so taking a moment to look into the practice of yoga and to see what are the things that are beneficial and how do I give credit where credit is due. In our culture, yoga has gone through the commercialization and the capitalization of, the effects of our country. And so we have yoga pants and, multi-million-dollar companies that are making money off of yoga candles, all the products. And so it can get really, really far away from the heart and soul of a practice that was created for liberation of the mind. And I love the link with social justice, because as I do this practice of breathing and moving my body, I'm actually making my body vehicle more prepared to be able to take action in the world. And so for me, that's how I have come into this study. I'm not going to stop the practice because it's a 20-year practice now for me, and I'm going to learn more and more how to be respectful and how to name that I am a white woman doing this practice. I think it's really important to do that. And so I'm definitely in the study for sure. I also want to name just a part about appropriation that I've seen about wearing feathers or wearing headdresses for white people specifically who have no connection biologically or spiritually to First Nations cultures, and how offensive that can be, really deeply offensive for First Nations people to see that, knowing the level of care, the level of initiation that goes into being able to wear feathers or wearing feather headdress. So it can cause a lot of pain and a lot of harm, actually, and sometimes I notice that white people who are engaging in these behaviors are not actually aware of that. So it's with gentleness and tenderness, but also firmness, that we're bringing this topic.
Yeah, well,
today.
I appreciate that, and also this, I think what escapes a lot of people with dominant identities is that there is a cost to people with oppressed identities to having that kind of hair or wearing those feathers. That's been taken from them, and or when they do it, there's actually violence that's often perpetuated on them that doesn't happen for people with dominant identities. And so it's really important to recognize that too, like, have I had to suffer the consequences of this? And if not, maybe it's not mine.
Yeah.
I remember a Native woman saying to me many years ago, when this was beginning to grow in our culture, they want to have our songs, they want to have our drums, but they don't want to know about the res. And that really struck me, because she grew up on the reservation. She knew what the cost was of being, of having her culture stolen, and the attempt by this government to wipe it out. And so that whole thing of being happy that maybe more attention was being paid to First Nations and Native peoples, but it was like skimming the icing off the cake. So I want that initial sweet sugar high, but I don't really want to know about what's in the cake, or even how you ground the flour to make the cake.
Yeah.
So that whole process, I think, is extremely, like I said, really causes harm.
Yeah.
And the first step is becoming aware and making the choice to become aware. And I think we live at a time where there's so much information that's available, not the least of which are these conversations, where to claim I don't have access to the knowledge is really kind of, I think, a very weak argument at this point.
Yeah. And before we move on to the next topic, I just want to say there's a meme or a picture that's going around social media where there's two pictures merged together. The top picture is a group of young white boys that are dressed as Indians. They're dressed with the feathers and the headdress, and underneath is an actual picture from the boarding schools where the Native people, the First Nations people, had the Indian beat out of them. And so you see pictures of dark-skinned Native First Nations children with short haircuts and European style, British style uniforms, and forced to sit in chairs and forced to conform in that way. And so the irony of cultural appropriation is really devastating. And so we want to have this episode that allows us to acknowledge cultural appropriation, but then go into reclamation and reparation. And so with this last third of our show that we have available, I just want to bring the topic of reclamation up. And for that, Louise, I know you have a beautiful quote to pull up on our screen and some beautiful stories about your own process of reclamation, and then we'll go into reparation and we'll close the episode for today.
Reclamation, it's really important to me today to be wearing what's called a rushniki in a culture of my motherline, which is the Ukrainian culture. I also brought today the matryoshka doll. The doll was a code word for sacred female energy. And the understanding of reclamation, as I went back to the dictionary, it said the reclaiming of desert, marshy, or submerged areas or other wasteland or cultivation for use. That whole understanding of submerged areas ties into insights from a Marxist, an Italian Marxist whose name was Antonio Gramsci. So perhaps we could pull up that image of Gramsci and this very powerful perspective he had about the role of the knowledge and wisdom of submerged cultures. There he is with his beautiful glasses and dark wavy hair. And Gramsci pointed out that until the stories of what he called these submerged cultures are tapped, there can be no authentic cultural transformation. And I think we're just at the very opening part in our cultural unfolding to learning about these submerged cultures. For me, a lot of that knowledge about the cultures that sourced Ukraine came from the work of Maria Gimbutas. And we'll pull up her picture so you can see this incredible woman who is a Lithuanian archaeologist and anthropologist who created a whole new field which she called archaeomythology. And what her research over the years of her skill in having command of 25 languages and showed was that predominantly all of the cultures of what we know as Western and Eastern Europe have these much older matriarchal cultures that preceded them before what we usually know as the patriarchal history. So for me, I remember in one of our classes, Lucia Birnbaum, who was my professor at that point, from Sicilian American, saying, if you cannot call yourself a feminist until you know the full extent of your motherline. And I really felt like somebody hit me in my chest because I was really proud of being a feminist, And so I began looking at what are these cultures and what does it mean to be a woman of Ukrainian descent who has these other cultures. So we have a couple of maps that I think will help orient us to the geography and where Ukraine is in Eastern Europe. It's been in the news recently because of Putin and Crimea and a lot of the violence that's been happening there over the last 4 or 5 years. So this is where we see Ukraine. And when Holly and Jamie and I were talking last night, we realized that a lot of our lineage is in this part of Eastern Europe. Jamie, you said you have Polish ancestry, and Holly, you said you had Czech ancestry. So all of those areas have matriarchal cultures. And I'd like now just to pull up that image of the one that is mine, that is the Kukatani Trypillian culture, that was one of the cultures that sourced contemporary Ukraine. And when I began to learn about that, I began to notice connections in that Ukrainian, in that Trypillian culture that was matriarchal in its roots, which did not mean the reverse in terms of power dynamics of patriarchy. Matriarchies were basically indigenous cultures that were very close to the wisdom of land and nature and animals, that had equal roles, unique but equal roles for men and women, as well as for people of different ages. And it didn't mean that there weren't conflicts. This was not a utopia. But the way of solving conflicts was not to build up huge bases of armaments, which have never been found, but to find other means of solving those conflicts. So as I studied more deeply about how this information was conveyed through arts, through embroidery, through decorating on eggs, I began to be amazed that a lot of the colors of the symbols were very similar to that of some indigenous cultures of the United States, as were what happened to these cultures. So in Ukraine, in contemporary times, in World War II, there was a systematic process of starvation. There was also punishment for speaking the language of Ukrainian. The colors that are in much of the art are red and white and black and yellow, which are very similar to the colors in many Native American cultures. So that increased my understanding and my also interest in these parallel histories.
Thank you so much, Louise. And it also has me just think about when I was at Standing Rock, I heard this quote from Starhawk, who was also there, and I'd like to pull this quote up. Starhawk is a prominent voice in earth-based spirituality and ecofeminism. And the quote is, "White people can't heal until they come to terms with the witch persecutions." And while that might seem like a bold statement for a lot of people to see, as we look at cultural appropriation and we hear from Louise about her own path through cultural appropriation and that emptiness and that void that has us as white people grasp or clutch to other cultures for our sense of connection to the earth, we see Louise has made this beautiful pathway to her own Ukrainian lineage, and that brings us to this moment of reparation. And we have just a minute left of our show, but what are some ideas that you have as we make these connections in our own lineage of reparations that we can do as we're inhabiting the territory of the Shasta and the Takelma people and others in our country with other tribes like that?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, and I suppose I'll sort of answer it and wrap up a little bit because of time, but I think one of the biggest things we can do is practice cultural humility, which means pulling from our own lineage rather than taking from other people's backyards, which we've been talking about here. And then also really recognizing that decolonization is not just a metaphor, it's an actual thing. And so looking at wealth redistribution and land redistribution. So I know we could talk about this a ton more, but I'm gonna conclude this and wrap it up. And so thanks for watching Tending the Threshold, where we talk about how to come together as things fall apart. I want to say thank you to our producer, Wanda Borland.
When I was young, I believed what they told me. And when I was young, they really tried to mold me. But then somehow I knew it wasn't true. They were confused. I had a clue within my soul that led me to a higher truth. But then somehow I knew it wasn't true. I was confused. I had a clue within my soul that led me to a higher truth. When I was young, I was told the greatest story